Hello. Today we'll be discussing the Leopold and Loeb case from 1924. Before I get into the discussion, I just want to take a moment to say that this case does contain some unpleasant subject matter. I don't mean to glorify it, but I feel that it is necessary to discuss it just so you get a sense of how horrible and heinous this crime was, and also so we might begin to speculate about why Leopold and Loeb committed the crime and what type of offenders they might have been. So the case began in Chicago, Illinois on May 21st, 1924. On that day, two best friends, Nathan Leopold, who was 18, and Richard Loeb, who was 19, were driving through some suburbs in Chicago in a car that they had rented, and they spotted a young boy walking home from school. Turned out it was 14-year-old Bobby Franks. They pulled over and offered Bobby a ride, and once he got in the car, they proceeded to beat him to death with a chisel. They then wrapped his body in a blanket and put it on the floor in the back seat of the car. They then proceeded to drive to a local restaurant where they had hot dogs and beer to celebrate the crime that they had just committed. They then drove around the city until dark, and then they drove out to a secluded area near Wolf Lake, and there was an embankment, a railroad embankment, and a culvert in this area. And they were worried about Bobby Frank's body being identified, so they removed all of the clothes, and they used hydrochloric acid to burn his face, his penis, and an identifiable scar on his body. And then they disposed of the body underneath a drainage ditch. And they were hoping that as water flew through the drainage ditch, that would flow over the body and it would speed up decomposition. And then they left the scene. They then called Bobby Frank's family, and they spoke with Jacob Franks. Mr. Franks was a multimillionaire, and they told him that they had Bobby, that they were holding Bobby hostage, and that they would return him for $10,000 in unmarked cash. And the following day, they sent a letter to the Franks family reinforcing the demands and also providing these very complex and convoluted instructions on how the Franks family was supposed to deliver the money to them. Basically, Mr. Franks was supposed to take the money and put it in a special box and then get on board a train and wait till the train got to a specific point, and then he was supposed to stand on the caboose and throw the money from the train after it passed a specific point. The family was actually going to comply with the ransom demands, but Bobby's body was found before they could do so. A construction worker actually saw some feet sticking up in the drainage ditch and called the police. The police came out, retrieved the body, and brought it to a local morgue. The police had been involved in the investigation just pretty much from the moment when Bobby disappeared. And so there was probably some thought that the remains would be Bobby Frank's. And Bobby's uncle went to the morgue and did identify the body as being his nephew. And he then called the family and told them not to comply with the ransom demands. So the investigation really got heated up at that point and focused on trying to find who killed Bobby Franks and who attempted this horrible extortion from his family. The initial investigation focused on Bobby Frank's teachers, and the police thought that this was a sex crime, and so they focused on Bobby Frank's teachers that they thought were homosexuals. Ultimately, this line of investigation and questioning did not lead anywhere. The case was broken by the discovery of a pair of glasses near Bobby Frank's body. So when the body was found, the police found these glasses near the body, and they were actually a very distinct, expensive, nice pair of glasses that had actually only started selling recently, and there were very few stores that were selling these glasses. And so the glasses were traced to a store called Almer and Co. in Chicago, and the records were checked, and they revealed that the glasses were sold to Nathan Leopold. So at this point, Leopold was brought in for questioning, and he acknowledged that the glasses were his, but he told the police that he had probably lost them when he was out in the woods bird watching. They then asked Leopold where he was on the day that Bobby Franks went missing, and he said that he and his friend Richard Loeb had been out driving trying to pick up women. So they brought in Loeb for questioning to verify the alibi, and Loeb ended up confessing to the entire scheme. Uh, and he said that he and Leopold had abducted and murdered Bobby Franks. Um, but his version of the story was that it was Leopold's idea to abduct and kill Bobby Franks, and that Leopold had been the one that had actually killed him. When the police then questioned Nathan Leopold, he also confessed, but he reversed the roles and he claimed that it was Richard Loeb's idea to kill Bobby Franks, and that it was Loeb that had actually done the killing, and that he himself, that Leopold had only driven the car and helped dispose of the body. So the police then dug into Leopold and Loeb's background. Who were these guys, and why did they commit such a horrible crime? So Nathan Leopold was born in 1904. He was the son of a very wealthy Jewish family. He was highly intelligent. He graduated with his bachelor's degree when he was 18 years old from the University of Chicago, and he was actually planning on going to Harvard and attending law school there. His IQ was estimated to be between 210 and 220. Leopold was described by the press at the time as the more attractive of the two, and also he was very socially awkward, very difficult to talk to. And later media accounts would say that he was more the follower, and that Richard Loeb was the leader in their relationship. Richard Loeb had a very similar background. He was born in 1905, also to a Jewish family that was very wealthy. He graduated with his bachelor's degree when he was 17 from the University of Michigan. He was very intelligent, though not as intelligent as Nathan Leopold. His IQ was about 160. Of the two, he was described as being the more attractive, and he was also extremely personable. He was very charismatic, a very smooth talker, could talk his way out of any situation. And later media accounts would say that he was the leader in the relationship. Leopold and Loeb did admit to having a homosexual relationship, but in the early 1920s, these details were actually censored from the press. It wasn't until many years later that the press acknowledged and discussed the nature of the relationship between Leopold and Loeb. So, why did they commit this crime? According to their attorney, Clarence Darrow, they basically killed for the thrill of the experience. They wanted to know what it would feel like to kill someone, and they also considered it a test of their intelligence to see if they could pull off the perfect crime. Um, Leopold and Loeb actually had committed some other crimes in the past. About 6 months prior to killing Bobby Franks, they had actually robbed their own fraternity and stolen a number of items. So this was not their first crime, but it was definitely their most violent crime, and it was their first brush with the law. So their families were both very well off, and basically they hired the best defense that money could buy. They hired Clarence Darrow to represent Leopold and Loeb. And Clarence Darrow, you may have heard the name before, possibly in reference to some other trials, but he was actually the most famous criminal defense attorney in the United States at the time of the Leopold and Loeb case. And so he was hired to represent Leopold and Loeb. We don't know how much he was paid, but for what it's worth, it was called the $1 million defense. So Clarence Darrow was very charismatic, very brilliant, just an absolutely brilliant legal mind. Um, and he realized that he had a very tough task ahead of him in defending Leopold and Loeb. And he made a number of strategic decisions that ultimately ended up working out and saving their lives. The first thing that he decided to do was to have Leopold and Loeb plead guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping for ransom. Now, Leopold and Loeb had confessed to the crime. There was physical evidence tying them to the murder and also to the extortion attempt. So there was really no question that they were guilty. The issue in the Leopold and Loeb case was not trying to determine their guilt or innocence. It was trying to determine whether they should be sentenced to life in prison or whether they should get the death penalty. And so ultimately, Darrow's job was to try to save their lives. And he achieved this in a number of ways. First, he decided to have Leopold and Loeb tried before a judge as opposed to a jury. And his rationale was that it would be easier to convince one person to save their lives than it would be to try and convince a jury of 12. And a lot of Darrow's tactics involve putting the blame for Leopold and Loeb's death squarely on the shoulders of the judge. And I'm going to read just a brief excerpt from Darrow's summation. But as you can see, he really puts the onus for Leopold and Loeb's death on the judge. Here's what he said. I am aware that a court has more experience, more judgment, and more kindliness than a jury. Your Honor, it may be hardly fair to the court. I am aware that I have helped to place a serious burden upon your shoulders, and at that I have always meant to be your friend. But this was not an act of friendship. If these boys hang, you must do it. There can be no division of responsibility here. You can never explain that the rest overpowered you. It must be your deliberate, cool, premeditated act. So when Darrow made those statements, you can really see how he's driving home the point that if anyone's going to sentence Leopold and Loeb to death, it would have to be the judge. Darrow was an opponent of the death penalty. He was vehemently against the death penalty, and he used the Leopold and Loeb case to grandstand and to voice some of his opinions and to work them into his argument that basically all life is worth saving. And so Leopold and Loeb, even though they committed this horrible crime, they needed to be saved. And also that our criminal justice system needed to be more progressive and that we needed to focus on rehabilitation and not on retribution. And so here's what he said with respect to the death penalty. Your honor stands between the past and the future. You may hang these boys. You may hang them by the neck until they are dead. But in doing it, you will turn your face toward the past. I am pleading for the future. I am pleading for a time when hatred and cruelty will not control the hearts of men, when we can learn by reason and judgment and understanding and faith that all life is worth saving, and that mercy is the highest attribute of man. So by making those statements, Darrow is pleading to the judge that all life is worth preserving and that let's move forward and move towards rehabilitation, not toward the barbaric policies of the past. And finally, Darrow argued that Leopold and Loeb's youth was a mitigating circumstance. So at that point in time, you weren't considered a legal adult until you were 21. So Leopold and Loeb, even though they were 18 and 19, they were still considered juveniles under the laws of the day. And so Darrow really played up on this. And here's what he said about their youth in a statement that he made to the judge. We have all been young, and we know that fantasies and vagaries haunt the daily life of a child. Here are two boys who are minors. The law would forbid them making contracts, forbid them from marrying without the consent of their parents, would not permit them to vote. Why? Because they haven't that judgment which comes only with years, because they are not fully responsible. So these are just some of the arguments that Darrow made in favor of Leopold and Loeb. In addition to this, Darrow also brought in a lot of psychiatrists to testify as to Leopold and Loeb's immaturity. And basically, the psychiatrists argued that Leopold and Loeb were sane. They had to avoid insanity in order for the guilty plea to work. That they were sane, that they knew what they were doing, but that they were immature. That they were just highly intelligent, but that they were immature. They were socially awkward. and that's why that they committed the murder. And so we needed to have mercy on them, basically. These tactics ended up being very effective, and that Judge Caverly, in the end, decided to sentence Leopold and Loeb to life in prison, and to spare their lives. So they were not sentenced to death. So Leopold and Loeb went to prison. Um, Richard Loeb ended up being killed in 1936 in a shower room fight, so he did not obviously serve much of his term. Leopold, on the other hand, did survive prison, and we have a pretty good record of his life when he was in prison. He actually used the time very wisely. He organized the prison library. He helped teach inmates how to read. He actually co authored a number of academic articles for the American Sociological Review and actually became a fairly well known sociologist while he was in prison. He wrote a lot about rehabilitation and juvenile offending. Um, Over the years, Leopold tried to distance himself from Richard Loeb. When Loeb was alive, they were in different prisons, so they didn't interact. Um, but he tried very much to distance himself from Loeb, distance himself from the crime, and especially after Richard Loeb died, the blame was really shifted squarely to Richard Loeb because, frankly, he couldn't defend himself. Leopold found religion when he was in prison. He wrote a book about his experience called Life Plus 99 Years. Ultimately, he served 33 years of his life term, and he was finally released in 1958. But at that point, he was in very poor health, and he did not talk to the press at that point in time. He ended up moving to Puerto Rico and became an x ray technician. He got married in 1961, and he and his wife traveled the world. And he would say to the press later that the reason he traveled and that he did some of these things was to make up for time that he lost while he was in prison. In 1971, he ended up dying as a result of some heart problems. So, a couple things that I want to draw your attention to. First is the changing media portrayal of the case. So the initial reports on Leopold and Loeb were that basically they were monsters, that they were bold and self-sufficient savages and intellectual supermen who thought they were above the law. The homosexual elements of the case were not mentioned in the earliest reporting. Later media reports, however, in the 1930s and 1940s, really shifted the blame to Leopold and Loeb's parents. And if anything, Leopold and Loeb became somewhat of a cautionary tale. So they were almost seen as sympathetic, but the argument really was that, well, you better not spoil your kids or they might end up like Leopold and Loeb. So again, they were a cautionary tale. It wasn't until after World War II that some of the homosexual elements of the case began to be mentioned in the press, and the case was viewed as just a perverse sex crime. Also, at this point, Richard Loeb was dead, so the blame shifted to him, and Nathan Leopold, who was still alive and still in prison, was seen as just being a follower. Over the years, Nathan Leopold offered a number of different explanations for why it was that they committed this crime, um, but he never expressed any remorse except for the shame that it brought to his family. And he may have been motivated to talk just to make a case for parole, but again, his explanations focused on blaming Richard Loeb and also just on the idea that they just did it for the experience. So, why are we still discussing the Leopold and Loeb case today? Why is it so prominent? I think we can connect a lot of the ideas from chapter one of the textbook to understand why Leopold and Loeb are so famous and why we're still discussing the case. First off, they were both very unlikely offenders, okay? They were both young, they were both highly intelligent. They were succeeding in school. They seemingly had everything to live for, and they threw away their lives to commit this horrible crime. A second reason is probably the innocence of the victim. Bobby Franks, being young, 14 years old, certainly undeserving of what ultimately ended up happening to him. A third reason would be the involvement of a prominent attorney. So Clarence Darrow, again being the most famous criminal defense lawyer at that point in time, definitely got a lot of people interested in the case. And the book also makes the argument that in the 1920s, there really wasn't a whole lot to do. And so there was a lot of radio and newspaper reporting of the crime, and people followed it because really there wasn't much else to do at that point. Did the case have any impact on the criminal justice system? Not so much. They pleaded guilty, so there was no trial. Obviously, the question of capital punishment was germane to the case, and there's still a lot of debate about capital punishment to this day, and that continues. Um, they were tried as juveniles back then. Today, they would probably be tried as adults. And also, there was the involvement of a lot of expert witnesses in the case, and that still goes on today. So that pretty much wraps up the discussion for the Leopold and Loeb case. If you have any questions about the case, please feel free to ask over email, and I would be happy to answer them. But that pretty much wraps it up for the discussion.